Even though informal from the perspective of accuracy, the easiest way to wrap your head around a historical framework of philosophy like that of Hegel is through the thesis, antithesis, synthesis trilogy of succession. And what I mean by accuracy is that Hegel himself wouldn't quite phrase it this way, but it's the best we've got for the masses. So a thesis is a state of affairs, if you want to think about the evolution of ideas as ontological, if you want something to grasp, really. As in, before the 20th century, for example, virtually every philosopher could be categorized as being continental. This is a jargon term, which is a philosophical tradition that looks at things more holistically, with a preponderance for the acceptance of antinomies, paradoxes, classical logical errors, things like that. And this is, mind you, regardless of whether some thinkers before the 20th century could be categorized as being more rigorous, more linear, more comprehensive, like Descartes. I think Descartes is a good example of a pre-analytic philosopher who still functions in accordance with the parts and wholes model of understanding that most analytical thought is characterized by. So, continentalism was the thesis, the one present for most of human history. Then came the actual analytical wave, which directly tied philosophy to logic, to mathematics, to any structure which can be completely formalized. And this can be called the antithesis. And the tension stemming inherently from the fact that these two traditions are direct opposites could only be succeeded by one of two outcomes. The first one is deflationism, which is a sort of reconciliation, or abolition, which just means war between the two, leaving just one paradigm to rule the world. And deflationism is what most people would consider the synthesis of this conflict, like a world in which the two may coexist, gathering adherents of notably different backgrounds and worldviews. And so it doesn't necessarily mean the merging of the two, even though it is happening in our time with this specific example of continentalism and the analytical tradition. I mean, quantified modal logic, specifically the variable domain type, is formalizing some of the most foundational philosophical arguments which are pre-analytical. And I'm going to give an example from Descartes, which, okay, sure, I just said he's kind of analytical, but not quite. It works. His argument of mind-body dualism can be fully formalized in that form, and it is logically valid. I don't have it on hand, but you can search it up. So this overarching extension of dependency between the two camps is quite apparent, but people treat it as a necessity, seeing as they perceive some incompleteness in both of the frameworks. The point of contouring this historical context was to eventually reach this new thesis that I have in mind, that perhaps these two opposites are not to be reconciled. This amalgam created by trying to solve the insufficiency of a system via the substitution of its flaws with parts of a totally distinct system is not more complete than either of the two systems. It is an accommodation for a widened perspective. I mean, just because you have in front of you all these alternatives that don't quite match each other, that are incompatible, it doesn't mean that they need to substitute their own flaws so that you can create a wholly perfect worldview. Let's look at the creation of worldviews, of frameworks, of systems. So, without any academic, formal influences, I believe, intuitively, most people would turn either to the Eastern spiritual side of philosophy or the empirical and observational side. It can be both, but yeah, as a rule of thumb, but this is how I believe it would pan out. So it begins with an undoubtable trust in our senses, in what we see, hear, and touch. we are able to observe the patterns in nature, right? The rainbow after the storm, the tree growing if in the right environmental conditions, etc. And sure, it would be extensively easier to map out the structure of the world if there was only one sample of each element, one tree, one rainbow, all existing simultaneously, nothing being similar or repetitive, nothing needing additional distinctions, the world being an amalgam of parts of whose existence we can be sure via their nature of being so distinct from one another. So if something is not X and it's not Y and it's not Z, then it will be some other letter. Identification via exclusion, definition via the meeting of opposites, the interaction of their sharp but harmonious contours. Now, unfortunately, the world contains what we shall call repetition, and repeated elements are necessary for the existence of relations. For if every individual part or object would simply be separated by an obvious contour, then no relation but that of identity would be needed. Even the relation of difference is just two relations of identity. So as such, though, sets appear, maps and functions appear, correspondence, groups, abstractions, and among these abstractions resides language. Language is a principal object of my study, since it is through its appearance that philosophical issues arise. If there exists more than one tree, what makes them all trees? Why do we intuitively form groups regardless of objective differences? This is the problem of definitions. So from here we embark on a quest for the substance of the world with a capital S, for the world with a capital W, of forms with a capital F. We start heading towards that lost Unitarian view of singular identities that we call the mental landscape. So in our mind, pictures that we have formed of the world reside in that utopia of singularity, of each concept being a concept and not needing duplication, of them being completely distinct. Abstraction and generalization allow us to create one of those problemless realms within ourselves. Though when we relate our utopia to the initial world, the problems reappear. Duality and repetition are the roots of philosophical issues. Unity is simple, convenient, and trustworthy. Thus, idealists appear, people who see the structure of the mind as a more trustworthy object of study. And they have their critiques. The critique consists in saying that the object and the subject of study cannot overlap, which is what happens in a fully idealistic worldview, because then unverifiable theories emerge and undetectable limits are created. Self-reference is a hellish enemy for any logical framework of thought that we know of today, even though we have something like paraconsistent logic and all these adaptations. But then again, you can say that it's a better approach because it actually works, because you are not ultimately indefinitely bound by the uncertainty of your senses being necessitated to trust them. It is a viable theory because it works, because it's pragmatic. And people view pragmatists as lazy deflationists, conflict dissolvers, avoidant types. But what if pragmatism has been the axiom, the tool that allows any study to occur relevantly and concretely all along? My point was to show that where we inherently adopt an axiomatic thought structure just by the forming of our intuition. And this is cemented, ascertained by the fact that language starts outlining our worldviews. Once we formulate something in a set framework in a manner that seeks to become universally understandable by all rational creatures, then it gains its identity, and with this, its place in our mental landscape. Here's the catch, though. Language ultimately always outputs an incomplete representation, a reason for which contradictions and incoherencies appear between our otherwise reasonable constructions. Okay, but how does this relate in any way to our daily life? This is the question that people bother philosophers with the most, I think. Because, I mean, anti-intellectualism is becoming increasingly trendier. The existence of issues is the existence of imperfections, which entails the existence of quote-unquote better alternatives, if we also accept the existence of perfection as a point of reference, right? And since most people take their thoughts to be indicators of reality still, to them the concept of perfection should be a human ideal, meaning that anti-intellectualism becomes perfectly viable, alongside every other paradigm that is excluded from the social ethos, from popularity, from our sight. The search for the antithesis resembles a child trying to find the perfect ball in a ball pit. I mean, they're all formless, they're all the same even though they're different colors, perceivably identical. But this is because they have not been chiseled and malformed by the practical social circumstances of implementation. Any idea sounds good in its unpolished, linguistically lacking form. And this is a reason for which people write and read books, and for which they should continue to do so. Because, I mean, the probability of error is severely decreased when a concept is articulated in just a larger quantity of forms. That's just how humans are. Time of exposure means time dedicated to the delicacy of what you ultimately extract from your study. Now, returning from that short tangent, the important thing to extract from this train of thought is that opposites are everywhere in the world surrounding us. Continental and analytical philosophy are just an example of a duality. They will never be reconciled because even in their unity, even their unity, a shared appreciation of both will be pragmatic. It will be an exercise of filling holes that are only created by the existence of the opposite. If you are familiarized with mathematical and logical formalism, with logical positivism per se even, you will find certain parts of continental philosophy, like ancient, medieval, and a large part of modern philosophy to be, wishy-washy, ungratifying, and this is simply because of your brain's familiarization with formalism. Even if you are a devoted continental thinker, you will twist in your bed at night worrying about the incompatibility of other frameworks with your framework. Because what this irreconcilable conflict is about is more in regards to incompatibility than incompleteness. I mean, many frameworks work just fine without alternatives. This is why it's so difficult to engage in intellectually honest debates, because from any dogmatic perspective you have a whole truth, and this automatically translates into the whole truth. It's like the necessitation principle in modal logic, in a way. If A is a theorem, then necessary A is a theorem. As in, if we take A for granted as an axiom, proven by no premises, then it's necessary. Then A becomes a necessary conclusion with no premises to support it. In our mind, truth functions in the same way. And we cannot leave our minds. I mean, we are bound by psychology at all times. Thus, learning and expanding your visual field will only entail distress. If you want to be pragmatic and appeal to cultural trends and propensities such that you may live a certain life, a life with certainty, you will inevitably decide on a paradigm that was chosen arbitrarily. In the philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn developed a three-stage theory of ideation that starts with the pre-paradigmatic period. And this is a period in which the battle for the winning cultural idea is still a free-for-all, a disbanded war of tiny camps, And in such circumstances, who can guarantee that deference will be offered in favor of the quote-unquote better paradigm, and not just the one most favored by the circumstances, by cognitive biases and such? Then a whole culture will be built around it, and we will be forced to await the antithesis. Then confusion will sprout with the synthesis, and human life will entrench its ends in means more complex than is feasible. Opposites will never be reconciled because the axioms that stand at their bases are imperceptible hyperobjects grander than our powers of deconstruction and analysis.